Mr. Whitmore, are those your children? The question cut through the warm Texas air like a crack in polished glass, and for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore didn't have an answer ready. The late afternoon sun hung low over the 600-acre ranch, casting long golden lines across the freshly cut hay as cameras flashed and reporters leaned forward, waiting for the billionaire farmer to unveil his newest agricultural expansion project. He stood tall in his tailored navy suit and worn leather boots, a man praised by business magazines as a visionary, a self-made empire builder who turned soil into billions. Behind him, a polished wooden sign read Whitmore Farms, growing the future. But the future he saw approaching now wasn't part of the script. A dusty silver SUV rolled past the press barricade and came to a slow stop just yards from the stage. The engine went quiet. Doors opened, and Ava Brooks stepped out. The wind lifted strands of her dark curls as she closed the door gently, her expression steady, unreadable. 6 years had softened nothing about her presence. If anything, it had sharpened it. She wasn't dressed for spectacle. Simple cream blouse, dark jeans, flats coated lightly in ranch dust. But she stood with the calm certainty of someone who had already survived the worst of what this land could offer. Then 3 small figures climbed out behind her. 2 boys and a girl, no older than 6, lined up instinctively at her side. The crowd's murmur deepened into something heavier. Each child had Daniel's unmistakable blue eyes, the same strong jaw, the same faint crescent birthmark near the right temple that Whitmore men had carried for generations. One of the boys shaded his face from the sun and squinted toward the stage. "Mom," he asked softly, loud enough for the nearest microphone to catch it, "is that him?" Daniel's throat tightened. He felt the weight of 100 lenses narrowing in on him, magnifying not his success, but his silence. 6 years ago, he had signed papers in a downtown Dallas office, convinced he was protecting his legacy. His parents had called Ava a distraction. Investors had whispered about image. He had chosen stability over trust, reputation over relationship. And Ava had walked away without a public word, carrying more than a broken marriage. Now she stood on his ranch, under his banner, with 3 living reflections of him blinking in the sunlight. The reporters sensed blood in the water. Questions began overlapping. "Are they yours? Did you know? Is this why your divorce was sealed?" Daniel's polished confidence, the same composure that closed billion-dollar deals, wavered at the edges. He stepped down from the platform slowly, boots pressing into the dry earth, each step measured but uncertain. Ava didn't move toward him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply met his gaze across the stretch of yellow grass between them. There was no anger in her eyes, no plea, only truth waiting to be acknowledged. And for the first time in front of cameras, employees, and the legacy he built from the ground up, Daniel Whitmore felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not fear of scandal, not concern for stock prices, but the unmistakable weight of a decision he could no longer outrun. The wind shifted across the ranch, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and gasoline from idling news vans, and Daniel Whitmore felt the past rising around him like dust he thought had long since settled. 6 years earlier, Ava had stood in a very different room, a high-rise office overlooking downtown Dallas, where the air smelled of polished wood and legal ink instead of soil and sunlight. She had been 3 months pregnant, though he did not know it then, sitting across from him at a conference table large enough to seat 20 board members. His attorneys had spoken more than he had. Words like asset protection, liability exposure, brand preservation filled the space between them. Daniel remembered how still she had been, hands folded neatly in her lap, wedding ring catching the light as if it refused to understand what was happening. His parents had warned him that the marriage complicated everything. Investors had hinted that the optics of a high-profile interracial divorce could damage expansion plans. He had convinced himself he was thinking strategically, that love did not survive under the weight of public scrutiny. When Ava signed the final document, she did not cry. She simply removed the ring, placed it on the table, and said quietly that dignity mattered more than wealth. He had interpreted that as pride. He had not considered it might have been strength. Now, standing 30 feet away from her on the land that built his fortune, Daniel studied her face again. Time had carved patience into her features, not bitterness. The children shifted beside her, small boots pressing into gravel. The girl, Nora, reached up and adjusted a braid that mirrored a style Daniel remembered Ava wearing on summer evenings when they would walk the fence lines together, dreaming about a family that would run through these fields. Back then, Daniel had promised her that this ranch would one day belong to their children. He had imagined sons with his name, daughters with her resilience. But when pressure mounted, he folded. He allowed outside voices to redefine what family meant. The memory tightened in his chest. A reporter called out his name again, but Daniel barely heard it. He was watching the way the tallest boy, Noah, stood with his shoulders squared, the same posture Daniel adopted during shareholder meetings. Nathan, the quieter twin, studied the ground with careful focus, tracing lines in the dust exactly the way Daniel used to as a boy waiting for his father to finish chores. These were not coincidences. They were continuations. Ava finally stepped forward, closing half the distance between them. The sun lit the edge of her face, and for a moment Daniel saw the woman he once asked to build a life beside him. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply held a manila envelope at her side, the paper bending slightly in the heat. The silence stretched, thick and undeniable. Daniel realized that whatever story he had told himself for 6 years was about to be replaced by the truth standing in front of him, small, breathing, and unmistakably his. The manila envelope in Ava's hand seemed impossibly small against the wide Texas horizon, yet Daniel Whitmore felt as though the entire weight of his empire rested inside it. The reporters had gone unusually quiet, their earlier questions dissolving into a tense expectancy that pressed against the still air. Even the cattle beyond the fence stood motionless, tails flicking lazily as if unaware that something far more significant than a business announcement was unfolding in the center of the ranch. Daniel stopped halfway between the stage and the gravel drive, boots sinking slightly into the dry soil. His heart beat in a slow, deliberate rhythm, not rushed, not panicked, but heavy. Ava closed the remaining distance with steady steps, the children following instinctively, their small shadows stretching across the ground like echoes of his own. She extended the envelope toward him without hesitation. The paper brushed his palm, warm from the sun. He recognized the thickness of official documents, the unmistakable stiffness of laboratory seals. His name was printed clearly across the front in bold black ink, Daniel Whitmore. No accusations, no dramatic flourish, just fact. He opened it carefully, aware that dozens of cameras were recording every movement of his hands. Inside were 3 certified DNA reports, each page stamped and notarized. He did not need to read the percentages to know. 99.99% certainty confirmed what his eyes had already seen. Noah shifted closer to Ava, but his gaze remained fixed on Daniel. Nathan swallowed quietly, his small fingers tightening around his sister's hand. Nora tilted her head slightly, studying him with cautious curiosity rather than resentment. They were not angry. They were waiting. Daniel's vision blurred for a brief second, not from tears, but from the sudden collapse of the narrative he had repeated for years. He had told himself that Ava would eventually seek financial leverage. He had convinced himself that if she ever returned, it would be with demands. Instead, she had arrived with proof and silence. "I never wanted your money," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly across the microphones without needing force. "I wanted them to know their father." There was no bitterness in her tone, only exhaustion and truth. The wind lifted strands of her hair again, and Daniel was struck by the realization that she had raised 3 children alone while he expanded his holdings from 200 acres to 600, while he graced magazine covers celebrating innovation and family values. His public image featured staged photographs beside borrowed horses and scripted interviews about legacy. Yet his real legacy stood barefoot in the dust in front of him. A reporter cleared his throat, ready to speak, but stopped when Daniel raised his hand slightly. It was the first intentional movement he had made since opening the envelope. He looked at Ava fully now, not as an adversary, not as a former spouse whose departure he justified, but as the mother of his children. 6 years ago, he chose perception over partnership. Today, perception was dissolving under the clarity of truth. He folded the reports carefully and lowered them to his side. The ranch felt different suddenly, not like property, but like a place that had waited too long for the sound of children's footsteps. The envelope remained in Daniel's hand, its edges bending slightly under the pressure of his grip, while the ranch that once felt like a fortress of certainty now felt exposed under the late afternoon sky. The sun dipped lower, painting the 600 acres in a wash of amber and long shadows, and Daniel became aware of how quiet the crowd had grown. Reporters who had arrived for profit forecasts and expansion numbers now stood suspended in a different kind of calculation. Ava did not step back after handing him the proof. She stayed where she was, grounded, shoulders relaxed but unyielding. The children gathered around her like a small constellation that revolved around her calm. Daniel looked at Noah first. The boy's chin lifted slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet expectation. Nathan's gaze drifted toward the cattle fence, studying the open land as if measuring how far it stretched. Nora squeezed Ava's hand once, then released it, taking a small step forward on her own. That single movement shifted something inside Daniel more than the documents had. She did not look afraid. She looked curious. "Why now?" Daniel finally asked, his voice steady but stripped of its usual authority. Ava met his eyes without hesitation. "Because they are old enough to ask questions," she replied. "And I will not answer them with half-truths." The simplicity of her words settled heavier than any accusation. Daniel remembered the months after the divorce, how he buried himself in acquisitions and board meetings, how he allowed his parents to frame the narrative that she had wanted influence rather than partnership. He had never called to confirm. Pride disguised as principle had kept him silent. Ava had left the state quietly, declining the settlement that would have secured her financially. He told himself that meant she did not need him. Now he understood that she had chosen independence over dependency, even when she carried more than herself. A breeze swept across the field, lifting dust around their ankles. Daniel lowered himself to one knee, not as a public gesture, but because standing felt suddenly dishonest. At eye level, the resemblance was undeniable. Noah's eyebrows drew together the same way Daniel's did when concentrating. Nathan blinked slowly, thoughtful, cautious. Nora tilted her head with the same measured curiosity that Ava once brought to every difficult conversation. "I did not know," Daniel said quietly, the admission directed not toward the cameras but toward the 3 children whose existence rewrote his past. Ava did not interrupt. She allowed the truth to stand on its own. "You chose not to know," she said gently, not as condemnation, but as clarity. The words did not sting. They steadied him. Around them, the reporters hesitated, unsure whether to intrude on a moment that had shifted from scandal to something more intimate and real. Daniel glanced back at the stage where his company logo gleamed under professional lighting, then returned his attention to the children. For years he had spoken about legacy in terms of acreage, expansion, and market reach. Now legacy stood within arm's reach, breathing, patient, waiting to see whether he would remain the man who chose distance or become the father who finally chose presence. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a rope losing tension strand by strand. Daniel remained on one knee in the dry Texas dirt, the DNA reports folded in his hand, while the sun dipped lower behind the windmill near the north pasture. 600 acres stretched behind him, land he once believed defined his legacy, yet the only thing that mattered stood within arm's reach. Noah shifted his weight forward, curiosity overcoming hesitation. "Do you have horses?" he asked quietly, his voice steady, not accusatory, just honest. The question caught Daniel off guard. Of all the things he expected, it was not that. "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice softer now. "We have 8. 2 are young. They are still learning." Nathan glanced toward the distant barn, eyes calculating distance the way Daniel once did, as a boy measuring how fast he could run before sunset. Nora stepped even closer, studying his face as if matching memory to reality. "Mom said you built this place," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. "I did." Ava watched the exchange without interruption, her expression calm but alert, as if guarding not from harm, but from disappointment. Daniel felt the weight of that trust more than any shareholder pressure he had ever faced. He stood carefully, brushing dust from his knee, then turned toward the reporters still frozen in place. For years he had mastered the art of controlled statements, curated interviews, polished narratives. Now he understood that control had cost him something irreplaceable. "This conference is over," he said, not with irritation, but with finality. "We will reschedule." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one argued. Something about his tone had changed. It was no longer corporate authority. It was personal accountability. The cameras slowly lowered. Assistants hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, but Daniel motioned for space. When the vehicles began pulling away, gravel crunching under tires, the ranch felt quieter than it had all afternoon. The stage lights clicked off one by one, leaving only natural sunlight and open sky. Daniel turned back to Ava. "I cannot change 6 years," he said, choosing each word carefully. "But I can change what happens next." Ava studied him for a long moment. "They do not need promises," she replied gently. "They need consistency." The simplicity of her answer cut deeper than criticism. Daniel looked at the children again. Noah's eyes carried expectation. Nathan's gaze held cautious hope. Nora's expression remained open, undecided. He extended his hand slowly, not forcing contact, just offering presence. "Would you like to see the horses?" he asked. The 3 children exchanged glances, a silent conference conducted in seconds. Then Noah nodded. Nathan followed. Nora hesitated, then placed her small hand in his. The touch was light, but real. Daniel felt something shift fully inside him, not a dramatic surge, but a steady realignment. For years, he built fences to protect what he owned. Now he understood that some fences needed gates. As they began walking toward the barn, the long shadows of 4 figures stretched across the field, merging briefly in the golden light, while Ava followed a few steps behind, watching carefully, not to control the moment, but to see whether this time he would choose to stay. The barn doors creaked open with a low wooden sigh as Daniel slid them apart, and the scent of hay, leather, and warm grain drifted into the cooling evening air. Inside, soft golden light filtered through high windows, catching dust particles that floated lazily like suspended time. Noah stepped in first, sneakers crunching over scattered straw, eyes wide as he took in the stalls lined neatly along the walls. Nathan followed close behind, studying everything with quiet concentration, his fingers grazing the smooth wooden rail. Nora paused at the threshold, glancing back at Ava for reassurance. Ava gave a small nod, not pushing, simply allowing her daughter to choose. Nora stepped inside. Daniel watched each movement carefully, aware that trust was forming in inches, not miles. "This one is named Rusty," he said, gesturing toward a chestnut gelding that lifted its head gently from a feed bucket. The horse's ears flicked forward, curious but calm. Noah moved closer, stopping when he reached the stall gate. "Can we touch him?" he asked. Daniel hesitated only long enough to ensure safety. Slowly, he replied, "Let him see your hand first." He demonstrated, palm open, movements measured. Rusty lowered his head slightly, breathing warm air against Daniel's skin. Noah copied him, small hand steady despite excitement. When the horse accepted the touch, Noah's face broke into a smile that carried no history, no resentment, only discovery. Nathan stepped beside him, observing before extending his own hand. Nora lingered near Daniel's side, her gaze shifting between him and the animal. "Do they run far?" she asked softly. "Sometimes," Daniel answered. "But they always come back before dark." The words settled between them heavier than he intended. Ava leaned against a support beam a few feet away, arms loosely crossed, not distant but watchful. The light caught her expression, revealing something close to relief but guarded by years of independence. Daniel recognized that she was measuring consistency, not charm. He walked the children down the aisle, explaining how feed was measured in pounds, how water troughs had to be checked daily, how even the strongest horse depended on routine. As he spoke, he heard himself differently. For years he had spoken about markets and margins with precision. Now he spoke about care. Nathan stopped in front of a smaller stall where a young filly shifted nervously. "She looks scared," he observed. Daniel nodded. "She is still learning who to trust," he said quietly. Nora glanced up at him at that. Outside, the sky deepened from gold to rose, then to a soft violet that stretched across the open Texas horizon. The ranch felt less like an empire and more like a beginning. Daniel realized that fatherhood would not be declared in a press release or proven by documents. It would be built the way this barn had been built, beam by beam, day after day. And as the children continued asking questions about saddles, fences, and sunrise chores, He understood that what he had once lost through distance could only be restored through presence. Evening settled fully over the ranch, and the barn lights cast long amber beams across the packed earth as the last streaks of violet faded from the Texas sky. The children lingered near the stalls, their earlier excitement softening into a quieter curiosity, the kind that comes when something unfamiliar begins to feel possible. Daniel leaned against the wooden rail, watching Noah ask careful questions about how much a horse eats in a day, listening as Nathan traced the grain of the wood with thoughtful fingers, noticing how Nora stood close but not clinging, as if testing whether this new space would remain steady. Outside, a pickup truck rolled slowly down the gravel drive, likely a staff member returning equipment, and the ordinary sound reminded Daniel that the world had not stopped. Only his understanding of it had shifted. Ava stepped farther into the barn now, boots brushing straw, her eyes moving from the children to Daniel and back again. She did not interrupt the moment, but she no longer stood at a distance. "We are not staying in Texas," she said gently, her voice low enough that only Daniel heard. The words landed without accusation. They were practical, protective. Daniel nodded once, absorbing the reality. "Where?" he asked. "North Carolina," she replied. "I accepted a position at a firm there. I start in 2 weeks." Daniel inhaled slowly. 2 weeks. For years, he had measured time in quarters and annual reports. Now time felt immediate, personal. He glanced toward the children, who were laughing softly as Rusty nudged Noah's shoulder with a curious nudge. "Do they know?" he asked. "They know we are moving," Ava said. "They do not know what you will choose." The clarity of that statement held no bitterness, only responsibility. Daniel felt the familiar instinct to calculate, to structure a solution in percentages and projections. But this was not a merger. It was not a negotiation. It was fatherhood asking for presence. He stepped closer to the children. "Would you like to see the pasture in the morning?" he asked them gently. "It looks different at sunrise." Nathan's eyes brightened. "We have never seen a sunrise on a farm," he said. Nora looked at Ava, seeking permission. Ava studied Daniel's face for a long second, measuring something deeper than logistics. Then she gave a small nod. "We can stay the night," she said. Daniel felt the shift immediately. Not victory. Not relief. Opportunity. Outside, the first stars appeared above the wide horizon, scattered and quiet. He realized that redemption does not arrive loudly. It comes like evening, steady and undeniable, asking whether you will light the lantern or let the dark settle in. As he walked with the children toward the farmhouse, explaining that mornings here begin before 6 o'clock and that the air feels cooler before the sun climbs, he understood that this moment was not about reclaiming control. It was about surrendering pride. Ava followed beside them now instead of behind, close enough to hear every word. And beneath the vast Texas sky, Daniel recognized that legacy was not measured in acres owned, but in mornings chosen. The house lights glowed softly against the wide Texas night as Daniel unlocked the farmhouse door and stepped aside, allowing the children to enter first. The scent of cedar and fresh linen drifted outward, familiar to him, foreign to them. Noah moved cautiously into the living room, eyes tracing the tall stone fireplace and the framed photographs that lined the mantel. Nathan paused near the staircase, running his hand along the polished banister as if testing its steadiness. Nora lingered in the doorway for a moment, then crossed the threshold fully, her small footsteps echoing gently against the hardwood floor. Ava followed last, closing the door quietly behind them, sealing the outside world away. The ranch felt different at night. Without cameras, without reporters, without expectation. Just space. Daniel switched on a lamp near the sofa, warm light spreading across the room in a circle that felt almost protective. "You can put your bags there," he said gently, nodding toward a woven bench near the wall. The children obeyed without hesitation, their movements cautious but no longer tense. Daniel moved toward the kitchen and filled 4 glasses with cold water from the refrigerator, handing them out one by one. When he gave Nora her glass, she looked up at him directly. "Are you coming with us to North Carolina?" she asked plainly. The question was not dramatic. It was simple, direct, the way children speak when they have not yet learned to soften expectations. Daniel felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Ava watched from across the room, her expression unreadable but attentive. He knelt again, bringing himself level with the 3 of them. If you will have me, he answered slowly, choosing truth over performance. I would like to be wherever you are. Noah exchanged a quick glance with Nathan. Mom says people say things, and then they forget, Nathan said quietly. Daniel nodded. Your mom is right, he admitted. Words are easy. Showing up is harder. He did not promise instantly. He did not overcommit. Instead, he stood and walked to the hallway, retrieving a framed photograph from the wall. It showed him years earlier, standing alone in front of the barn on the first day the ranch officially opened. He carried the photo back and placed it gently on the coffee table. I built this thinking it would be the most important thing I ever created, he said. I was wrong. Ava's breath shifted almost imperceptibly at that. Silence filled the room, not uncomfortable, but reflective. The house, once quiet by design, now held the soft sounds of children's voices and the hum of possibility. Daniel turned toward Ava. I will speak to the board tomorrow, he said calmly. I will adjust my schedule. I will spend time in North Carolina. Not as a visitor. As their father. Ava studied him carefully, searching not for charm, but for sincerity. The night stretched beyond the windows, vast and dark, yet inside the farmhouse the light remained steady. Daniel understood that redemption would not be earned in a single evening. It would require mornings, flights, consistency, humility. But as Noah asked whether he could see the sunrise from the porch and Nora leaned lightly against his arm without hesitation, he realized something had already begun to change. For the first time in years, he was not calculating outcomes. He was choosing presence. Before sunrise, the ranch was wrapped in a cool blue stillness, the kind that settles over open land just before the first light breaks. Daniel stood on the wide wooden porch, hands resting on the railing, listening to the faint rustle of wind through the pasture grass. The air felt different at 5:30 in the morning, lighter, honest. Behind him, the screen door creaked softly. Noah stepped out first, hair still tousled from sleep, followed by Nathan and Nora wrapped in light sweaters that Ava had packed in their overnight bags. Ava came. Last, quiet, observant, her presence steady but no longer guarded. The horizon began to glow faint orange along the edge of the fields. Daniel did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, aware that this moment did not require explanation. Nora moved closer to the railing and leaned forward slightly. It is quiet, she whispered. It always is before the sun rises, Daniel replied gently. Nathan watched as the first thin line of gold broke across the land, stretching slowly over 600 acres that once represented achievement and now felt like an invitation. Noah folded his arms along the porch rail the same way Daniel did, mirroring him without noticing. The light grew stronger, painting the barn roof in warm color, touching the fence posts one by one, revealing the open fields that had witnessed yesterday's confrontation and now stood unchanged, patient. Daniel felt something settle fully inside him, not dramatic, not loud, but certain. He turned slightly toward the children. This place will always be here, he said. But where you are is where I need to be. He did not promise perfection. He did not claim redemption in a single breath. He simply stated direction. Ava studied him in the growing light, searching for the familiar flicker of pride that once overruled compassion. She did not find it. Instead, she saw a man who finally understood that power without presence is empty. The sun climbed higher, washing the porch in warmth. Nora slipped her small hand into his without hesitation this time. Nathan stood closer, shoulder brushing his side. Noah looked up at him and nodded once, not fully trust, not fully doubt, but possibility. Ava exhaled slowly, tension leaving her shoulders as if the dawn itself had eased it away. No speeches followed. No dramatic declarations. Only four figures standing side by side as the morning took shape around them. The ranch, the business, the public image, all of it remained, but none of it felt central anymore. As the sunlight spread across the fields and the first birds lifted into the sky, Daniel understood that legacy was not built in headlines or holdings. It was built in mornings chosen again and again. And as the children turned toward the kitchen, asking about breakfast and whether they could help feed the horses later, he stepped forward with them, not behind, not ahead, but beside, allowing the quiet of the sunrise to close the distance that 6 years of silence had created.